They said the blizzard would break by morning, but that was 3 nights ago. Clint Avery pressed his gloved hand against the neck of his horse, whispering a prayer that barely made it past chattering teeth. Snow swirled in blinding sheets, clinging to his beard, seeping through every seam of his coat. He couldn't feel his fingers anymore, or his boots. Just the dull ache of cold, and the bone-deep weariness that comes when a man's been riding too long with nowhere left to go. His horse, Jasper, stumbled beneath him. The poor beast had carried Clint further than any sane man would ask. Through frozen riverbeds and wind-swept hills where the sky itself felt like it might collapse under the weight of the storm. Then came the moment Clint had been dreading. Jasper buckled. Clint jumped down just in time, but the horse didn't rise again. He knelt beside the animal, snow building on its flanks, and placed a trembling hand on its neck. Jasper was still breathing, but not for long. Clint stayed with him until the breathing stopped, and then, for the first time in years, he cried. He hadn't cried when his brother was buried. Not when he left the army. Not when the woman he loved had turned from him without a word. But now, alone in a snowstorm with nothing left to lean on, he wept. When the wind rose again, Clint stood and looked to the east, or what he hoped was east. He walked for how long? He didn't know. Hours maybe. His limbs grew heavy. Thoughts slowed. Snow bit into his skin like 1,000 tiny knives. And when his legs finally gave out, he didn't try to rise again. Last thing he saw was a flicker of light through the swirling white. Then nothing. He awoke to warmth. Firelight danced across timber walls. A kettle hissed softly nearby. The scent of wood smoke and stew hung in the air. Rich and real. Clint blinked, unsure if he was dreaming. Then he heard her voice. "You're lucky I had the lantern lit." It was quiet, steady, a woman's voice. Low and a little tired but kind. "You were half frozen when I found you," she added, barely breathing. Clint turned his head and saw her standing by the hearth, wrapped in a worn shawl, her dark hair streaked with gray. Eyes watchful but not afraid. He tried to speak, but his voice cracked like dry wood. She brought water, held it to his lips. "My name's Ruth," she said. "You're in my cabin. And for now, you're safe." Clint didn't answer. He couldn't. But in that moment, he knew one thing with strange certainty. He hadn't found this place. It had found him. Have you ever felt rescued by a stranger? A moment, or a kindness you didn't see coming? Let me know below. And if this story is just starting to stir something in you, stick around. Clint stayed in the cot for 2 full days before he could sit upright, without the world tilting sideways. His legs ached. His lungs burned every time he coughed. But there was warmth in his fingers again, and his heartbeat no longer sounded like a distant drum in a canyon. The cabin was small, but solid. Everything had a purpose. The chipped basin near the window, the tin hooks for drying herbs, the rocking chair that creaked even when no one sat in it. Clint noticed it all, as he slowly regained the strength to lift his head and his thoughts. Ruth moved about with quiet efficiency. She didn't talk much, didn't ask questions, and didn't flinch when he woke, sweating from dreams that tasted like gunpowder and regret. When he could finally speak, his voice was rough. "You live out here alone?" She looked up from the pot she was stirring and nodded. "Since spring. Your husband, gone 3 winters ago." He didn't press. She didn't explain. That became the rhythm of their first few days. Unspoken understanding, shared silence, and the gentle ritual of healing. She fed him broth and bread, tended to his cracked lips, replaced the wet rags on his forehead, all without asking his name. It was 3 days later, as snow finally began to melt from the roof and the wind eased, that she found him standing by the window, staring out at the blank horizon. She approached without sound, holding a worn blanket. "You shouldn't be up yet." Clint looked at her, then back outside. "I didn't think I'd make it," he said quietly. "You didn't," she replied, draping the blanket over his shoulders. "But something in you refused to die." Clint turned slightly. "Why did you help me? I could have been anyone." "You were," she said. "Just someone." And that was enough. He didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. Let the silence hold it. That night, he sat by the fire instead of the cot. Ruth sat across from him, mending a pair of worn gloves with steady fingers. The fire crackled between them like a heartbeat neither wanted to name. "I had a horse," he said suddenly. "His name was Jasper." Ruth looked up. "I'm sorry. He carried me through worse," Clint continued. "But I pushed him too far. He died out there, cold and alone." Ruth didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, "No, he didn't die alone. He had you." Clint's jaw clenched, but not from anger. He just nodded. In the stillness that followed, Ruth reached over and added another log to the fire. Her hand brushed his for a second, accidental, brief, but enough to remind them both. Warmth isn't just a thing that lives in wood and flame. Sometimes, it lives in the people you least expect. By the end of the week, the snow had softened into slush, and the roof began to drip. The days were still cold, but the storm had passed, leaving behind that strange hush that follows something fierce, like the land itself was catching its breath. Clint walked further, now limping still, but steady, around the clearing behind the cabin. A split-rail fence surrounded the garden, though winter had long since claimed it. Beyond that, the woods rose quiet and bare, their branches dripping with melt. He found himself looking back at the cabin often, not to check if Ruth was watching, but maybe hoping she was. Inside, she kept busy, always something in her hands. Chopping, washing, stitching, tending the hearth. But every now and then, he'd catch her pausing just for a moment, watching him from behind the curtain, like she wasn't sure if she should be worried, or something else. That evening, over stew and cornbread, Clint finally asked, "Why out here, all alone?" Ruth set her spoon down. "The house was my husband's. Built it with his own hands before the war. We dreamed of filling it with laughter. But dreams change." He waited, not pushing. She glanced toward the fire. He didn't die in battle. He came back, but something inside him never did. He drank, yelled, left for weeks at a time. When he finally didn't come back, folks called it desertion. I called it peace. Clint didn't speak for a long time. Then, I knew a few men like that. One of them was me. Ruth looked up, eyes searching. "Is that what brought you through the storm?" Clint nodded. "I'd been writing too long, trying to outrun something that was always a step ahead. Army gave me a badge. The badge gave me pride. Then the pride turned sour when I started burying more friends than bandits." She didn't flinch, didn't pity him. "That kind of pain," she said quietly, "either hardens you or hollows you." Clint looked into the fire. "And what did it do to you?" "I think it taught me how to live without waiting for someone to come save me." Outside, wind brushed softly against the windowpane. The world, it seemed, had grown quiet enough to listen. Then Ruth stood and walked toward a cabinet near the hearth. She returned with a small bottle and 2 chipped cups. "Apple brandy," she said. "Homemade, just enough for when the night feels too long." She poured, handed him a cup. Clint held it, unsure. "To what, then?" he asked. Ruth raised her cup. "To outlasting the storm. Even when you don't believe you can." He looked at her, then clinked his cup against hers. They drank, and for the first time since Jasper fell in the snow, Clint felt the warmth go all the way through. The days grew longer. Clint had taken to chopping firewood in the mornings, though his leg still complained with every swing. Ruth let him, silently grateful for the growing stack by the door. He fixed the shutter on the south window, mended the handle on the well bucket, and even dug a drainage path behind the cabin where meltwater had started pooling. He worked with his hands, not to prove himself, but because something inside him needed the doing, needed to be useful, needed to rebuild. Ruth didn't say much about it, but every evening, she set an extra spoon on the table without asking. They found their rhythm. He learned she sang softly, while kneading bread, old hymns, and half-forgotten lullabies. She learned he whittled small animals out of wood when his thoughts got too loud. Neither of them said what they were to each other. Not yet, but one evening, just as the sun dipped behind the hills and turned the sky soft with orange and violet, there was a knock at the door. Clint was cleaning his rifle near the hearth. Ruth was tending a kettle. They both froze. No one ever knocked here, not unless they had reason. The knock came again, firm, polite, but heavy. Clint stood first, eyes sharp. He motioned for Ruth to stay back, then stepped to the door and opened it slowly. A man stood there, late 40s, maybe 50. Trim beard, clean coat, saddlebags slung over one shoulder, and a worn revolver holstered at his side. He looked weathered, but not rough. And something about him said he wasn't a stranger to law or war. "You, Clint Avery?" the man asked. Clint didn't answer right away. "Who's asking?" The man gave a small nod, more of acknowledgement than friendliness. "Name's Roy Keenan. Used to ride with Marshall Toland. We crossed trails once, back in Dead Elm." Clint relaxed only a fraction. That was a long time ago. Keenan glanced inside, saw Ruth, then looked back at Clint. "Mind if I come in?" Clint hesitated, then stepped aside. Ruth poured another cup of coffee without being asked. set it in front of Keenan as he took a seat by the table. The man sipped once, then sighed. You always did find better coffee than the rest of us. Clint folded his arms. Why are you here, Roy? Keenan set the cup down. Word is, there's a man looking for you. Claims you walked away with information that doesn't belong to you. Clint's jaw tightened. That man got a name. Ellis Crane. Clint cursed under his breath. Ruth looked between them, silent. He's been asking questions in town, Keenan continued. Real polite, real quiet. But he's not alone. He's got riders, you know the type. Clint nodded. Yeah, I do. Keenan leaned forward. I don't know what happened between you and him, Clint. And I'm not asking. But you need to be careful. This place, it looks peaceful. But men like Crane don't care what you've built. They care what you know. And they'll burn the world down to keep it quiet. The silence that followed was heavy. Ruth finally spoke. He won't find Clint here. Not unless he wants a fight. Keenan looked at her, surprised. Ma'am, no disrespect, but these men, they don't scare easy. She stared back, calm and steady. Neither do I. Clint almost smiled. Almost. Keenan rose. I'll ride on. Just thought you deserved the warning. Watch your back. When the door closed behind him, Clint stared into the fire. Ruth came too. Stand beside him. Who is Crane? She asked softly. Clint didn't look away from the flames. Someone I should have buried a long time ago. That night, sleep came slow. Clint lay on the cot near the fire, listening to the wood crackle and pop. Ruth had gone to her room hours before, but he knew from the shifting creaks in the floorboards that she was awake too. Outside, the wind had returned, not a storm. Just that high, lonesome whine the plains make when they remember how empty they used to be. Clint rose quietly, pulled on his coat, and stepped out into the night. The snow had hardened into crusty patches, but stars filled the sky sharp and close, like you could reach up and cut your hand on them. He walked to where the fence ended, near the tall pine, and leaned against the post. He didn't want to leave. That thought had taken root days ago, but now it bloomed, painful and real. He didn't want to run again. Not from men like Crane, not from his own history, and especially not from the strange, unexpected peace he'd found here, in the quiet kindness of a woman who asked nothing of him but presence. Footsteps behind him broke the stillness. Ruth had pulled a shawl around her shoulders and walked up beside him, her breath fogging in the air. You always this quiet when trouble finds you? She asked. He smiled faintly. Only when I'm thinking about staying put. She studied him a moment. What are you afraid of? He looked out toward the trees. That I'll bring death to your doorstep. That you'll hate me for not warning you sooner, that, if I stay, I'll lose you anyway. Ruth stepped closer, her voice low. You didn't bring the storm, Clint. You survived it. That's a different kind of man than the one who causes it. He turned toward her, eyes tired but open. I've buried partners. Watched friends ride into ambushes I should have seen coming. I carry things I can't put down. Ruth's expression didn't waver. Then set some of it down here. No one said you have to carry it alone. The wind tugged at her shawl. Clint reached out and held it in place without thinking. Her hand brushed his, and for a moment neither moved. Then she said softly, You're not the only one who's lost people. He nodded. But you stayed. I did, she said. Because grief doesn't mean you stop living. Just means you learn to love quieter things. The moon hung low over the hills, and the night stretched long. But between them, something had already changed. Clint looked back at the cabin. Smoke still curled from the chimney. That place had saved him. But Ruth was what made him want to be saved. I won't let him touch this place, Clint said finally. I know, she replied. And if you're going to fight, Clint, don't do it alone. They walked back together. Not as strangers anymore. Not as survivors, either. But as two people who had decided, for the first time in a long time, that there were still things worth standing still for. Have you ever found yourself on the edge of leaving only to realize you were meant to stay? Share that turning point in the comments. The snow had melted into mud by the time Crane arrived. It was just after dawn when Clint spotted the rider on the ridge, dark coat. Slow gait. The kind of posture that says, I'm not here to talk. Behind him, two more men followed. Both riding with the loose arrogance of men who believed no one in a cabin could stop them. Clint stepped out onto the porch, rifle slung across his shoulder. Inside, Ruth was at the stove, frying potatoes. She didn't ask, she only paused, hands still, as if she'd already known this morning would come. Clint turned toward the sound of her footsteps on the wooden floor. They're here. he said quietly. She nodded once. How many? 3. She took off her apron, folded it carefully, and reached behind the tall cupboard. Clint watched in surprise as she pulled out a short, polished shotgun. It fit in her hands like it had always belonged there. My husband taught me to shoot before he taught me to cook, she said calmly. Clint nearly smiled. Remind me not to make you mad. They stood in the doorway as the riders came closer, horses kicking up wet earth. When they stopped, the one in front of Crane removed his gloves, one finger at a time. Slow and deliberate. He looked older than Clint remembered, but not weaker. His eyes were cold and calculating. A man who'd lead too much to remember what the truth ever looked like. Well, Crane said. Thought maybe I'd find you rotting in some ditch. Clint didn't expect this. His eyes drifted to Ruth. Appraising, dismissive. Clint didn't flinch. You've found me. Say your piece. Crane smirked. You took something from me. Letters, names, evidence of things that should have stayed buried. You hand him over, and I walk away. You won't walk far, Clint said. We both know that. The men behind Crane shifted in their saddles, hands near their belts. Ruth raised the shotgun. A little. You should know. The last man who tried threatening me is buried under my garden. Crane raised an eyebrow. Charming. Clint stepped forward 1 pace. I'm not running anymore, Ellis. You want a war. You picked the wrong place. I've made my peace. And I'm not letting you drag it back into the dark. Crane's smile dropped. You always were a fool with a conscience, he said flatly. Then his hand moved. Quick but not quicker than Ruth. Her shotgun fired once, deafening in the morning air. One of Crane's men fell backward off his horse. Clutching his shoulder, Clint raised his rifle, eyes locked on Crane. Don't, he said. You pull that trigger and no one leaves alive. Crane's fingers twitched. His horse pawed the ground then. Slowly, the man eased back in the saddle, eyes burning. This isn't over, he growled. Clint nodded. No, it's just done. Crane turned his horse. His wounded man stumbled after him, swearing. The third followed without a word. And just like that, they rode off into the trees, 3 silhouettes fading into a fog that hadn't yet lifted. Clint lowered his rifle. Ruth exhaled slowly. He turned to her. You all right? She looked him in the eye. I am now. For a long moment, they stood in the doorway, watching the morning reassert itself, birds returning, a breeze brushing through pine needles. Then Ruth said, with the faintest smile, you want breakfast, or do you want to bury your reputation? Clint chuckled, heart still thudding, but warm now. I think I can do both. It had been 3 days since the gunfire. The patch of earth where Crane's man had fallen was now just dirt again. Ruth had raked it flat. Without a word, the way some people sweep ashes off a hearth after a long night. Life had resumed its rhythm, slow and simple. But nothing was quite the same, because peace, when it's earned, hums deeper than silence. Clint found himself waking early, not from nightmares, but to the smell of coffee and the creak of Ruth's footsteps near the stove. He'd stretch, dress, step outside, and breathe in the morning like it belonged to him again. He had no plan now, no pursuit, just this place. And her. That morning, Clint stood beside the garden fence, running his hand along the frost-stiff rails. The sun was just touching the tops of the trees, painting the woods gold. Behind him, Ruth stepped outside with 2 tin cups of coffee. She handed him one. He took it without needing words. For a while, they drank in silence. Then Ruth spoke. You planning on leaving? Clint stared into his cup. The question had lived in the back of his mind for days, but never from her lips. I don't know, he said. Part of me thinks I should. I brought danger to your door. Don't want to bring more. She sipped slowly, then said, you also brought kindness. Fixed things that hadn't worked right in years. Taught me how to laugh again. Clint turned to her. I didn't do much. You stayed when it mattered, she said. That's more than most. The wind picked up, tugging at the scarf wrapped around her neck. Clint reached over to adjust it gently, his fingers brushing her skin. She didn't move away. You're allowed to stop running, Clint, she said. This land, it's harsh, but it doesn't ask you to be perfect. Just honest. He looked at her early, looked past the quiet strength, the stubborn resilience, the hidden sorrow. And he saw what he'd been trying to find his whole life. Someone who didn't ask him to be more than he was. Just to be here. I don't know how to be still, he admitted. Ruth smiled gently. Then start with today. Chop some wood. Fix the roof. Stay for dinner. Clint nodded. Dinner's a good place to start. They shared a look, half amusement, half something deeper, and walked back to the cabin. Steps in sync. Inside, the hearth still burned warm. The walls no longer felt like shelter from the world, but like the beginnings of a home. That evening, they sat side by side on the porch, watching the light fade across the hills. No words, just the sound of the wind in the grass and the small, steady rhythm of two hearts learning how to be quiet together. The morning came with frost on the windows and a red sky over the trees. Clint was mending the fence again. His hands had grown to know the rhythm of nails and would better than any rifle. Ruth was in the kitchen, humming a tune as she kneaded bread dough. Sleeves rolled up and cheeks warmed by the stove's glow. It was the kind of morning that didn't ask for anything but presence, until the knock came. Not loud, not threatening, just a single tap hand. When Clint opened the door, no one was there. Only a satchel slung over the post, and inside it, a letter. Clint turned it over in his hands. No name, just his initials on the front in blocky handwriting. Caruth stepped beside him, drying her hands on her apron. He looked at her. Mind if I read it here? I'd mind if you didn't. He unfolded the letter, and the paper crackled like old leaves. The ink was faded, but the words were clear, written by a marshal he hadn't heard from in nearly 5 years. Clint, if you're reading this, then I imagine someone's tried to dig up the past. Maybe Crane, maybe worse. But before the dust settles, you deserve the truth. You were right to walk away. The badge stopped meaning something a long time ago. I only wish I had the nerve to follow you. If they come for you, know this. You didn't bury the law. You saved it from becoming something unrecognizable. I kept the letters. The ones you wrote about the ranchers, the children, the lies. They matter. You matter. God help me. I hope you've found peace out there. And if you haven't, look around. Maybe it's closer than you think. Tolan. Clint read it twice, then folded the letter with careful hands, like it might crumble if touched too hard. Ruth said nothing, until finally she asked, "Do you want to keep running?" He shook his head. "No." "Then burn it," she said gently. He blinked. "What?" "Not because it doesn't matter," she explained, "but because you don't need it anymore." Clint looked down at the letter, this echo from a former life. Then, without a word, he walked to the hearth and tossed it in. The paper curled, blackened, and vanished into flame. No ceremony, no regret, just release. That night, Clint sat on the porch steps with Ruth beside him, shoulders touching, firelight flickering through the window behind them. "I think that was the last thing tying me to who I used to be," he said. Ruth glanced at him. "Then maybe now, you can start becoming who you were meant to be." He reached for her hand, and this time, she didn't hesitate. Spring crept in slowly, like it wasn't sure if it was welcome. The snow melted into earth. The brook near the cabin began to sing again, soft and persistent. Buds pushed from bare branches like small promises. Clint had never cared much for seasons before, but now, he noticed everything. He planted potatoes with Ruth one afternoon, laughing when the soil got under his nails. She showed him how to mark rows with twine and rhythm, not just guesswork. They moved together like they'd done it for years. That night, over supper, Ruth said something that stopped him mid-bite. "You've stopped checking the window." Clint looked up. She didn't smile when she said it, just stated it, like a fact. And it was true. He'd stopped watching the tree line every night, stopped bracing for hoofbeats in the dark. He had, without even realizing it, begun to feel safe. Clint set his fork down. "Ruth," he began, then paused. The fire crackled. The kettle on the stove whistled softly behind them. "I've never been good at saying things," he admitted. "You're saying something now." He nodded slowly. "I never meant to stay. I didn't think I had it in me. I'd buried too many things. Carried too much I didn't know how to put down." She waited. "But out here," he continued, "with you, it's the first place I haven't wanted to leave. Not because it's quiet, not because it's safe, but because you're here. And that makes it enough." For a long moment, Ruth didn't speak. Then she stood up, crossed the room, and sat beside him on the bench not across from him. Like always, beside she reached for his hand. "You don't have to fix everything," she said softly. "You don't have to protect me from the world. I've lived through enough to know how to survive." She paused, then added, "But if you're offering to stay out of guilt, not out of duty, but because you want to, then, yes, Clint Avery, you are welcome here." His throat tightened. "I don't just want to stay," he whispered. "I want to belong." Ruth smiled real this time, quiet and strong. Then maybe we build something, she said. Not perfect, just honest. They sat like that for a long time, the fire warming their shoulders. The night gentle around them. Outside. The stars bloomed. Inside. Something old finally exhaled. And something new began. The fence got finished by May. Clint stood back, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, surveying the new posts and rails that ran clean and true across the edge of Ruth's land. Of their land. That word had taken time to feel right, but now, when Ruth handed him a tin cup of water with that soft little smile, and their hands brushed just slightly, it didn't feel borrowed anymore. It felt chosen. The barn was next. Small, sturdy, with enough space for 2 horses and a stall for the goat Ruth had been threatening to barter from the neighbor down the ridge. Clint had repaired the roof shingles with nails he found in the shed. Careful and slow, like he was piecing back something inside himself. One morning, Ruth placed a small bundle wrapped in linen on the table. "For you," she said simply. Inside was a pocket-sized leather-bound journal. Blank pages. "I thought," she said, "maybe you'd want to write things down now. Not for the world. Just for you." He ran his hand across the cover. Something rising in his chest he didn't know how to name. "Thank you," he murmured. Weeks passed, like the turning of a quiet song. They grew things: potatoes, onions, squash. They read aloud on cool evenings. Ruth's voice slow and warm. Clint's still a little unsure but steadying. He carved her a set of measuring spoons from driftwood he found after the spring thaw. Some nights, he still dreamed of gunfire, of trails going cold, of names on old wanted posters. But when he woke, there was always the sound of her breathing beside him. Steady. Real. That was the difference. One afternoon, while Ruth was trimming herbs by the window, Clint stepped out to the hill above the cabin. The same place he'd nearly died that first night. The wind was gentler now. The trees were green again. He looked out over the land, the cabin, the smoke rising from the chimney, the small garden plot. And for the first time, it didn't feel like something he was passing through. It felt like something he belonged to. Later, he found Ruth folding laundry by the porch. "You ever think," he said slowly, "how strange it all is? How I found you. Or maybe, how you found me." She looked up with a glint in her eye. "I think some things don't need explaining. They just need tending." Clint chuckled, then stepped closer, brushing a lock of hair from her face. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "I know," she whispered. And with that, they sat, not as lost souls or broken things, but as 2 people who had stopped waiting for the world to fix them, and started building something quiet, something warm, with their own hands. A life. Not perfect. Not dramatic. Just true. Have you ever realized that home wasn't a place, but a person or a quiet moment you chose to stay in? I'd love to hear your reflections in the comments. And if this story touched something in you, subscribe for more like it. We're building something here, one story, one heart at a time. Thank you for riding with us.